Welcome back to our online mathematics lesson series. The topic is Commercial Arithmetic 2, and today we look at compound interest. Recall simple interest, which we dealt with in our previous lessons. Simple interest is simply calculated using the same principal amount in every interest period. What that means is, if we have total interest period 2 years and that interest is computed every year, then the same principal sum is used to calculate interest for year 1 and the same principal sum is used to calculate interest for year 2. And so the formula is PRT over 100 used to calculate interest, simple interest, where P is the principal sum, R is the rate, and T is the total interest period. Interest period simply means the number of times interest is calculated. If interest is calculated every 6 months, then it means in 1 year we have 2 interest periods. So in 2 years there will be 4 interest periods, and that will be the value of T. Compound interest is calculated on the amount of the previous interest period. In this case, the principal used in the current interest period is the amount of the previous interest period. When calculating compound interest, the principal keeps on varying for every interest period. Let me explain this further. If we invest 5,000 for 3 years and interest is calculated every year, during year 1, the principal invested is 5,000. At the end of the year, interest is calculated. Before we move to year 2, we determine the amount at the end of year 1, which will be interest for year 1 plus principal for year 1. That will be the principal used for year 2. And that is why we say the principal keeps on varying for every interest period. At the end of every interest period, the interest for the period is added to the principal at the beginning of the period to get the amount at the end of that interest period. This amount is reinvested in the next interest period. At the end of the entire period, the compound interest is calculated as amount subtract principal sum, where A stands for final amount or amount at the end of the entire period, and P stands for initial sum invested at the beginning. That is the original principal sum. Let us look at this example. Calculate the amount on shillings 5,000 invested for 3 years at 10% per annum compounded annually, hence the compound interest. In the above case, interest is calculated every year at 10% using the simple interest formula. And so, because the total interest period is 3 and interest is calculated every year, we shall have 3 interest periods. That is to say, interest will be calculated 3 times. So let us look at the interest during the first year or the first interest period. The amount at the beginning of the sum invested at the beginning of that year is 5,000. The rate is 10%. So we calculate the interest, we have 500. So at the end of year 1, the amount is 5,000 plus 500, which is 5,500. This is the amount which is carried forward to year 2. And so, as we begin interest period 2, the sum invested is, or the sum reinvested is 5,500 at a rate of 10%. Once again, we calculate the simple interest during year 2. It comes to 550, and the amount at the end of year 2 is 5,500 plus 550, which gives us 6,050. Now, as we move to year 3, or interest period 3, the amount invested is now 6,050 at 10%. Once again, we work out the simple interest for year 3, and we get it as 605. Together with the original sum invested, the amount at the end of year 3 is 6,655. This is the amount at the end of 3 years. Now, what is the compound interest? Compound interest is the difference between the accumulated amount at the end of period, subtract the original principal, 6,655, subtract 5,000, and our compound interest is 1,655. It is not simple interest, it is compound interest because it was calculated on the basis of varying principles. You have seen that every year we used a different principal sum. Note that to calculate compound interest, the accumulated amount must first be calculated. The above method is called step-by-step method. Let us apply this method in this example. Calculate the amount using step-by-step method on the following. 1. 10,000 invested at 8% compounded annually for 2 years. Compounded annually means interest is calculated at the end of every year. Number 2, shilling 6,000 invested at 12% compounded semi-annually for 18 months. That means interest is calculated every 6 months. And therefore in 18 months, we will calculate interest 3 times. Now, we look at the first question. There are 2 interest periods. So interest period 1, the sum invested is 10,000 at the beginning of the year at 8%. We apply the simple interest formula and we get 800 as the interest at the end of year 1 or period 1. So the amount at the end of period 1 is 10,800. That is the sum of principal and interest. 10,000 plus 800, we get 10,800. This amount is reinvested in year 2. So at the beginning of period 2, our principal is now 10,800, once again reinvested at 8%. We apply this formula and we get the interest as 864, so that at the end of period 2, the amount is 10,800 plus interest of 864, and that gives us 11,664. This is the final amount at the end of 2 years. Question 2. 6,000 was invested at 12% per annum for 18 months, but interest was compounded semi-annually, that is every 6 months. And that means if the annual rate was 12%, the rate for 6 months will be a half of 12, which is 6%. So at the end of 6 months, we shall use the rate of 6%. Now, 6,000 invested at 6% during interest period 1, the interest becomes 360, and the amount at the end of interest period 1 is 6,360. The 6,360 is reinvested in interest period 2. So at the beginning of interest period 2, the principal sum is 6,360. 360, once again invested at 6%, because the rate for every half a year is 6%. Now we work out the interest and we get it as 381.6. At the end of interest period 2, the amount is 6,360 plus 381.6, giving us 6,741.6. This amount is reinvested in the next interest period at 6%, giving us an interest of 404.496. And so the amount at the end of interest period, or the third interest period, will be 6,741.6 plus 404.496, which gives us 7,146.096. This is the final amount at the end of the interest period of 18 months. I hope you have followed, and you'll agree with me that it is pretty simple. Okay. Here is an exercise for you. You can try this exercise to test yourself whether you followed the process of calculating compound interest using step-by-step method. Now, you realize that the step-by-step method can be very long and tiresome when there are many interest periods. For instance, if interest is compounded for 15 interest periods, there will be 15 steps. This, at some point, can be very confusing. The compound interest formula is based on the step-by-step method, and it will make the process of calculating the accumulated amount very simple and very fast. Now, suppose a sum of Kenya shillings P is invested at R% per annum for 3 years. Calculate the amount at the end of 3 years. Since interest is calculated at the end of every year, it means there are 3 interest periods. Now, interest period 1, the principal sum is P, the rate is R%. What is the interest? We apply the simple interest formula. Our principal is P, our rate is small r, and so our interest for interest period 1 is PR over 100. The amount at the end of that period will be principal plus interest. In this expression, which is algebraic, you can see P is common, so we bring P out and we have amount as P into 1 plus R over 100 as the amount at the end of interest period 1. Now, the amount at the end of interest period 1 was this one here, which now becomes the principal at the beginning of period 2. So this again is reinvested at R%. We apply this formula, principal times rate times 1 over 100. We simplify this, PR over 100. So our interest is PR over 100 into 1 plus R over 100. This is the interest at the end of period 2. So what is the amount? We add this to that, and so we have this expression here. You can see this is the amount, principal plus interest. at the end of period 2. Now, we can simplify this. We can make this look simple. P is common. Also, 1 plus R over 100 is common. So we bring them out of the bracket. So we factor out P into 1 plus R over 100. And so we remain with 1 plus R over 100. If we bring this one out, we remain with 1. And we take P into R plus 1 R over 100 outside, we shall remain with R over 100 in bracket. So 1 plus R over 100 times 1 plus R over 100 becomes 1 plus R over 100 squared. So this is the simplified expression for the amount at the end of period 2. This is carried forward to interest period 3 as the sum invested at R%. Again, we apply the simple interest formula. So we have principal sum times rate over 100, and we simplify it to have PR over 100 into 1 plus R over 100 squared. This is the interest. What is the amount at the end of period 3? We take interest plus principal, and we have this expression here, this long expression here. It's simple. So we simplify it by factorizing what is common. So we inspect it and we can see P into 1 plus R over 100 all squared is also here. So we shall factor this one outside, and we remain with 1 plus R inside the bracket. So 1 plus R over 100 all squared times 1 plus R over 100 power 1 will become 1 plus R over 100 power 3. So this is the amount at the end of period 3. Okay. Now, look at the amounts at the end of every interest period. Are you able to establish a trend or a pattern? Take your time and go through the amounts at the end of every interest period to see if you can establish a pattern. Now, let us go through the amounts at the end of every interest period together. At the end of year 1 or interest period 1, the amount is this one here, P into 1 plus R over 100 power 1. At the end of interest period 2, the amount is P into 1 plus R over 100 to the power 2. At the end of year 3 or interest period 3, the amount is P into 1 plus R over 100 to the power 3. Look at these expressions. Are you seeing some pattern or some trend? What is the amount at the end of years 4, 5, 6, and n years? Take your time to think and see if you can come up with the expressions for the amount at the end of year 4, at the end of year 5, at the end of year 6, and at the end of n years or n interest periods. Okay, I hope you came up with the following. At the end of year 4 or interest period 4, the amount is the amount is P into 1 plus R over 100 to the power 4. At the end of 5 interest periods, we have P into 1 plus R over 100 to the power 5. At the end of 6 interest periods, we shall have P into 1 plus R over 100 to the power 6. And at the end of n interest periods, the amount will be P into 1 plus R over 100 to the power n. And this is the general formula for calculating the accumulated amount on principal P at the end of n interest periods. We call it the compound interest formula, where A stands for accumulated amount at the end of interest periods, R is the rate per interest period, and N is the number of interest periods. Now, using the compound interest formula, calculate the amount on shillings 5,000 invested for 2 years at 10% per annum. Number 2, shillings 20,400 invested for 4 years at 12% per annum, compounded every 3 months. Okay, let us look at the first one. We apply this formula for getting the accumulated amount on principal P after n periods. Now, P is 5,000, R is 10%. There are 2 interest periods because interest is calculated at the end of every year. So in 2 years, we have 2 interest periods, so our n will be 2. We substitute these values into the formula, and we have this, which turns out to be 5,000 into 1.1 power 2, which gives us the accumulated amount at the end of 2 years as 6,050. You can see, using the formula makes it pretty short and faster. For the second one, we apply the same formula where P is 20,400, but now rate was given as 12% per annum, but interest is compounded every 3 months. That means in 1 year, interest is compounded or calculated 4 times. So in 1 interest period, the rate will be 3%, that is 12 divided by 4, because in 1 year, interest is calculated 4 times. So we use the rate of 3% for every 3 months, and in 1 year, we have 4 interest periods, that is, interest is calculated 4 times. So in 4 years, we will have 16 interest periods, and therefore our value of n is 16. Now, we substitute into the formula, and we have this 20,400 into 1.03 power 16. We use our calculator to get the value of this, and finally, the accumulated amount at the end of 4 years will be 32,736.01. Remember, R is rate of interest applied in every interest period. This is very important. We were given 12% per annum, but again, we are told that interest is calculated every 3 months. So in 1 year, interest is calculated 4 times. And for every quarter, we apply 3%. That is 12% per annum divided by 4. Will give us the rate for every 3 months. Now, to wrap it up, you can try this exercise. To wrap it up, you can try this exercise. Calculate the accumulated amount, hence the compound interest on shillings 10,000 invested for 3 years at 18% per annum. Number 2, shillings 50,742 invested for 5 years at 10% per annum compounded semi-annually. Number 3, shillings 108,000 invested for 3 years at 12.6% per annum compounded every 4 months. And finally, shillings 10,500 invested for 1 year at 24% per annum compounded every month. That's all for now. In our next lesson, we will discuss further problems on compound interest. Until then, this is your teacher, Mr. Onyango. Thank you.